So once again, welcome everyone to the DMRC Fridays seminar. And welcome everyone in the room and welcome everyone on Zoom. So I'd like to start out by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands where we're meeting today, the Turrbal and Yugara, and pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I pay my respect to their elders, laws, customs, and creation spirits, and recognize that these lands have always been places of teaching, research, and learning. And I acknowledge the important role Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people play within the QT community. So I just hop back to this slide again to make sure that it's been clear to everyone that this event is live captioned and that you can access the live transcript on your Zoom windows with the live transcript button, and you pick show subtitle. So most of you are familiar with the Digital Media Research Center, but if in case there are someone on Zoom who are not, I'd like to say welcome to QT and to the DMRC, which is the world-leading Center for Media, Communication and Law Research. And our goal is to have our research leading to a flourishing digital society. So today we have a seminar that is investigating how platform users experience safety and harm online. And we have three DMRC researchers sitting next to me here, and I will present them briefly. So the next closest to me is Dr. Ariadna Matamoros-Ferna. Is a lecturer in digital media at the QT and chief investigator in the DMRC, an associate investigator in the ARC Center for Excellence for Automated Decision Making and Society. Her research focuses on the entanglement between technology and user practices in reproducing systemic inequality. Her recent projects have examined platform governance in relation to memes and other controversial humorous content. Next to Ari sits Dr. Zahra Stardust. And Zahra is a socio-legal scholar in the intersections of sexuality, technology and law, and she's a postdoctoral research fellow in the ADMS. Her projects examine the data governance of sex tech, the implications of algorithmic sexual profiling, and how content moderation practices impact sexual cultures. And at the other end of the table is Dr. Rosalie Gillett. And Rosie is a postdoctoral research fellow in the ADMS as well. And her research lies in the intersection between online gender-based violence, automated decision-making systems, and platform governance. And as a postdoc research fellow, she investigates what data platforms need to build automated tools that prevent harm and enable users to feel safe. So before we get started, I also would like to acknowledge the sensitivity of the topics we are dealing with today. And discussing online harm is important, but we also need to be mindful of our well-being. And as we progress through this presentation, there may be texts, images, and discussions that cause concern for you. And if this is the case, please prioritize your well-being. Just leave the room or disconnect from Zoom if that is best for you. And if you need support, please reach out to the support service such as 1-800-RESPECT or Lifeline. Okay, so with that, I hand over to our panel. And yeah, without further ado, I'm not sure who's starting. Is that Zahra?
I'm going to start, yeah.
Okay, there you go.
Well, thank you so much, Patrick, and thank you to all of you, especially those of you who are here in person. We're going to take a more interactive approach to this panel instead of us each presenting individual PowerPoints about our work. So we're going to frame the discussion around 4 central questions that we've come up with, which relate to online harm, the responses of digital platforms, the impacts of automation, and then what we could be doing differently. And then we're each going to speak to each of those questions from the perspectives of our different work, which is Ari's work on humour and harm, and Rosie's work on harm and dating apps, and my work on online sexual subcultures. And then after that, we'll open up into some discussion and hopefully comments from you. And Ari is going to get us started with the first question, which is, in what ways do digital platforms facilitate, host, and amplify harmful content and behaviours?
Great, yeah, thanks. Thanks everyone for coming. So yes, Zahra has said we are all studying harmful content and behavior on social media platforms. And we thought that as a start, it would be good to briefly contextualize why this recent focus on harm in current debates about like legitimate regulation of speech and conduct on social media platforms. And it's important to do some definitional work around harm because platforms' limited understanding about what constitutes and causes harm is one of the reasons why they leave multiple harms unaddressed when they moderate content. So to begin with liberal notions of harm that are captured in the work of philosophers John Stuart Mill and Joel Finberg are foundational in how platforms think about harm. So John Stuart Mill, writing in the 19th century England, came up with the harm principle as the necessary threshold that needed to be reached to justify intervention into individual affairs. So both like the state intervention or social intervention. So for him, it's just we should have like absolute like individual freedom as far as we don't hurt like others. And Mill did not really define harm, but in the context of speech, he made clear that speech acts could only be harmful when they constituted a clear incitement to violence. So this idea of physical harm, inciting to physical harm, or defamation, which is like reputational harm. And a century later, philosopher Joel Finberg drew on Mill's thinking to further theorize harm as the needed threshold to justify criminal punishment of individuals. So Finberg, what he wanted to do is to help legislators to really differentiate between content that was harmful and not. And what Finberg did that it was useful is that he provided a definition. And he conceptualized harm as the setting back of a person's interest. And he was particularly concerned with setbacks to individuals' welfare interest, which he understood as the basic requirements necessary to build a good life. Now, the three of us align with scholarship that has criticized these liberal notions of harm for concealing really real injuries and for marginalizing some conceptions of the good life, because probably was John Stuart Mill and Joel Finberg's conception of the good life, it's quite different to our conception of a good life. And both Mill and Finberg centered individual actions and agency over structural factors and power dynamics when deciding whether a harm threshold was reached. So that's why we argue that we need new approaches to understand what constitutes and causes harm. As Zahra said, in my research, for example, I use feminist standpoint theory to center the experiences of protected groups regarding what causes and constitutes harm in relation to humorous expression. Because racist and sexist jokes would have never been considered harmful by Mill and Finberg, unless these jokes were clear threats to violence. And in a paper I've written with DMRC PhD candidates Luisa Bartolo here in Rulum and Luke Troiner, we argue that when humor punches down on historically marginalized groups and when there's a clear imbalance between the speaker and the target of the joke, this humor is harmful rather than merely offensive, which is subjective. And the harm in harmful humor extends beyond the indignity of the target of the joke and constitutes a broader social harm insofar as these jokes work to materially reinforce systemic inequality. And this idea of social harm works across the work of the three of us, and we will just unpack throughout this discussion.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Ariadna. So as Ariadna has already alluded to, everyday violence and abuse online is not an isolated phenomenon. And so rather it reflects these broader societal attitudes towards women and other vulnerable and marginalised populations that minimise and excuse harm. So harmful behaviour online towards women, though, is bolstered by what Sarah Benet-Weiser calls a larger cultural context of popular misogyny. And so this means that while platforms, of course, don't create harassment and abuse, they do play a really key role in enabling, facilitating, reinforcing, and amplifying harmful behaviours. So to answer this first question here, I wanted to briefly talk about my PhD research. And the purpose of this research was to investigate the range of men's behaviour that women experience as intrusive on the dating app Tinder. And so I went beyond focusing on criminal acts, and I used Liz Kelly's continuum of sexual violence to account for the ordinary yet deeply insidious intrusions. So for this research, I interviewed women to investigate the experiences that made them feel really uneasy, uncomfortable, and unsafe. And so as an app that facilitates both in-person and online encounters, the women I spoke to spoke about a range of things that happened to them, both on and offline. And so online, this included things like attacks about their physical appearance, but also unsolicited requests for sex. And then of the women who did meet with men offline, they also spoke about how they were physically or sexually assaulted, and sometimes both. So a significant finding from this research is that so many of the things that make women feel unsafe on Tinder are normalized. And as Ariadna's research shows us, harmful content can even appear quite humorous. So my research shows us that it's also not just about this overt hate speech or threats of physical violence that make women feel unsafe. And of course, this is a really big part of the problem, but these more everyday and normalized behaviors are deeply insidious too. So what else my research shows is that there's actually this mismatch between how women understand and experience harm and how platforms conceptualize the problem. What we know when we talk to women is that they experience harm in this completely different way to what we think about when we think about content moderation, which is, of course, individual pieces of content. So adding to the problem, several of the women who I interviewed said that they reported these rule violations to Tinder, but the app didn't do anything. They didn't receive any kind of follow-up messages from the platform. And so also, so many of the women didn't actually report to the platform because they thought they might be overreacting, or they just knew that Tinder wasn't going to take their report seriously. And so this meant that for so many of these women, they had to develop their own safety work strategies because they just couldn't rely on Tinder to mitigate this harm. And so I think this really importantly shows how platforms can play a really key role here in amplifying harms, which I think Zahra will talk about in some more detail now.
Yeah, thanks, Rosie. I also am going to draw upon some of my doctoral research for this question, and I want to illustrate how platforms often talk about harm as if, like you've said, it's individual pieces of content or it's interpersonal harm between users. But users also perceive harm more broadly as something that platforms perpetrate on a systematic level. And my research examined the regulation of pornography, in particular the ways that platforms governed sexually explicit content, and it involved autoethnography, archival research, and qualitative interviews with queer and feminist porn performers and producers in Australia. And my participants described different kinds of online harm that can overwhelmingly be understood through themes of extraction and exclusion. So social media platforms are under pressure to address issues like non-consensual intimate imagery and child sexual abuse material, and they have largely done so by prohibiting all kinds of sexuality, nudity, sexual solicitation on platforms, which has affected a range of users from people who are simply seeking to hook up to sex educators and also sex workers. And on social media, my participants described experiences of being shadow banned, suspended, deplatformed, maliciously flagged, and having their content repeatedly removed, even if it did comply with the terms of service or the community standards. And among payment processes, they described a denial of access to financial infrastructure due to prohibitions on the use of financial services for any kind of sexual good or sexual transactions, which impacted their ability to maintain a livelihood. Even on the platforms where sexual content was permitted, they described very arbitrary rules and standards that prohibited completely consensual and lawful activities in ways that didn't really have so much to do with harm, but was more related to corporate or reputational risk or heteronormative sensibilities. And then at the same time, the participants described experiences of extraction, so being used by platforms to build up their commercial base, populating content, increasing their size and viability, only later to be treated as collateral damage when those same platforms decided to introduce a policy and remove sex entirely. And Tumblr is a great example of that. OnlyFans' recent announcement and then their subsequent backflip when they were planning to prohibit sexual content. This is a picture from Lena Chen and Maggie Oates' art piece, which is called Only Bands. And it's an interactive game that was created by sex workers and allies that explores the policing of marginalised bodies and digital surveillance. And my participants also described concerns that their content was being non-consensually scraped or pirated or shared, sometimes by tech startups who wanted to mine porn star databases to create anti-trafficking software, or by aggregate porn tube sites who were ripping content and then distribute it for free, or by users who would create deep fakes, which Maggie McDonald's describes as often being simply decapitated porn stars. And then there were barriers to people being able to actually take down that content because they feared that they wouldn't be seen to have reasonable expectations of privacy because they were already nude on the internet. Or to do so would mean they had to upload their legal identification, which would then put them at risk of stalking or harassment or identification from law enforcement. So there's many different kinds of harm here that we could be concerned about, similar to what Ari described as social harm, because they entrench structural inequalities. So marginalized communities are experiencing barriers to accessing sexual health resources, harm reduction, community support. They're being excluded from participation and belonging in the public discourse. The prohibitive policies are also contributing to a broader sanitization and gentrification of online space, which leads to diminished conversations about sexual health and discriminatory practices that keep people in precarious labor. And in addition, important social justice work is also being stifled. And there's a group called Hacking Hustling based in New York, a sex worker collective who did a piece of community research called Posting into the Void, where they found that 51% of sex worker activists had experienced shadow banning that had interrupted their ability to do further movement organizing. So in these situations, when we're thinking about online harm, the conversations are less about harm between users and more about platforms themselves as perpetrators of harm. But those kinds of harm rarely receive airtime when compared to the protectionist narratives of platforms.
So we will move now to our second question, that is, what steps are governments and platforms taking to limit harm perpetrated through digital networks? And again, our research on understanding harm is situated in a context where some governments are pushing new regulation to put pressure on platforms to limit the harms carried out through their networks. In Australia, for instance, there's the online safety bill that will take effect in January 2022 that hands the e-safety commissioner the power to penalize platforms that fail to remove material online that it's likely to cause significant harm to the Australian community. In the UK, a similar bill not only wants platforms to take care of illegal content, but also lawful but harmful content and activity. And this includes things like misinformation, online abuse, or content about eating disorders, self-harm, and suicide. And what these bills want is to identify categories of harm that have sufficient evidence base, and that they want to push platforms to prescribe clear and proportionate regulatory sanctions for them. So Zahra will unpack some of the limitations of the Australian Online Safety Bill. But what I like to argue is that the online harms regulation debate is a good opportunity to center the experiences of historically marginalized groups regarding what causes and constitutes harm, especially in bills like the UK, that they want to also kind of regulate this lawful but harmful content and activity. And our point, if you will, is that social media platforms and other important stakeholders involved in ending online abuse could adopt a more holistic approach to dealing with harms than that which many legal systems currently support. So one approach that, as I said, would center the voices of those whom the law has historically ignored. And this is important because the way that a society defines harm should not be fixed, and obviously is not objective. It's always socially situated. And as scholar John Gardner argues, shifting definitions of harm act as a barometer of our dynamic cultural values. So in a sense, a focus on harmful humor, everyday misogyny, and the constant prosecution of sexual content on social media platforms provides a glimpse into what it might look like if platforms and policymakers were willing to kind of evolve conceptualizations of harm that would be more inclusive and take like account of those with least political power in society.
Thanks, Sari. Like you said, I think there is a role for this legislation that encourages us to think differently about harm, that harm is broader than unlawful content. My main concerns about the Online Safety Act are about how those decisions are made and who makes them and what kind of oversight there is. And also that sex is often being conflated with harm as if they equate to one another in all circumstances. Social media has often done, or traditionally done this poorly, with very little transparency over decision-making about sexual content, but then at the same time, governments do not have a great history in classifying sexual content either. And our new Online Safety Act received royal assent in July. It contains several new initiatives, from cyberbullying protections to the removal of non-consensual intimate imagery. It has rapid website blocking powers to prevent the circulation of abhorrent violent material. It can require search engines to delete links within 24 hours. It can require app stores to prevent downloads, and it attracts civil penalties for non-compliance. And the bill received substantial criticism from a number of digital rights bodies. This is an image from Digital Rights Watch public campaign, but I'm just going to touch on a few of the problems. The first is that under this new online content scheme, users can complain about any sexual content online that is not subject to a restricted access system. It reproduces a classification framework that was already problematic in terms of how it organized sexual content, and then applies it to an online environment. So now users can complain about a broad range of content, which includes actual sex, simulated sex, implied sexual activity, as well as nudity. And it invites complaints in an environment where we already know that sexual content creators experience malicious flagging. The second issue is the affordance of unchecked power on the Commissioner to make those decisions about online content. So the the e-safety commissioner can then decide whether or not to take down the content if they think fit. And they're not required to give any reasons. There's no criteria for what warrants removal. There's no process for users to be notified or have opportunity to respond to complaints. There's no requirement to publish transparent enforcement data that would allow researchers or civil society to hold those decisions into account. And Electronic Frontiers Australia described it as effectively returning to having a chief censor rather than a classification board. Then the third issue is that the Act also affords the Commissioner power to create this restricted access scheme, and the government has recently issued a call for evidence on this. A restricted access scheme could actually take many different forms, but the government is very actively at the moment investigating mandatory age verification for users accessing any sexual content. And this may involve you uploading your identity documents, scanning your fingerprints, using age estimation software, such as going through facial recognition technology, or having your age estimated by artificial intelligence based on behavioural signals. And the UK had explored this, but then dropped its plans in 2019 following some difficulties around implementation and privacy concerns, including critiques that this could create a database of Australian porn consumers that contains people's sexual preferences and their browsing histories, and that was something that could be leaked or sold or hacked or misused. And then the fourth problem is this incentive for platforms to simply remove and deplatform all sexual content in order to comply with the online standards. So if platforms employ AI at scale to screen and detect nudity, which risks overcapture, or if this is simply too expensive or too onerous, they might just take the simpler route and decide, well, let's just prohibit sexual content altogether. So the way the legislation is drafted contributes to this problem of increasingly privatized and arbitrary and unaccountable decisions about the kinds of sex and sexualities that can be visible in public space. And then in this attempt to redress harmful content, the process itself is likely to have harmful consequences for users. So it can lead to a lack of trust and confidence in the system. Also a lack of clarity for users to know how to actually comply with the system, and a chilling effect on the kinds of content that can be shared or created.
Thanks, Zahra. So as Ari and Zahra have already discussed, governments are taking really significant steps to supposedly prevent online harm. So I wanted to talk about what it is that platforms are doing in this space. So as digital platforms try to deal with the huge amount of content and users on their services, you will be aware that they're relying really heavily on both human and automated content moderation systems. And so what platforms moderate actually tells us a great deal about whose interests and safety they prioritize, and what technology companies actually understand as harm and safety. So Zahra and I, with our research assistant, Nick Dowse, have been working on a project together where we are investigating how the dominant platforms, Facebook, TikTok, Twitter, YouTube, and Tinder, conceptualize safety and harm. And so we've collected their newsroom posts, and we're analysing the posts that are about safety and harm, looking at what tools and interventions they are developing and deploying, and the discursive frames that actually sit behind these. And so I must admit, this is a work in progress study, and we've only analysed some posts by TikTok, Twitter, and Tinder. But so far, we can glean some really interesting preliminary insights from this research. And one thing that we can really see here are these similarities between top-down content moderation systems and Western criminal justice models. So many of you here may be aware that our criminal justice system is really resource intensive, and it does little to rehabilitate offenders and centre victim survivors. Like our criminal justice system, platforms leave victims out of decision-making processes, and they really rely on punitive punishment, often removing those who break the rules, and they don't give them any effective reintegration strategies. So we can even see similarities in the way that platforms talk about how they're trying to prevent harm on their networks. In one post on Twitter, for instance, it described its 3 strikes approach to content moderation. So under this platform logic, addressing harm requires increased automated tools that detect discrete pieces of content or bad apple users who break these rules. And this approach is perhaps unsurprising, since the logics of platforms only allow them to see moderation answers which are scalable. As we can see from these newsroom posts, platforms are really committed to developing and deploying new tools that detect harmful speech. Interventions like Tinder's behavioural nudges, they're called "Are you sure?" and "Does this bother you?" They claim to detect harmful messages, and they are scalable, but they really focus on these discrete pieces of harmful content. And this framing does little to actually consider the different ways that people experience harm online and the broader cultural contexts and structural and systemic conditions that actually enable it, such as hierarchies of oppression and inequality. And I think this is a really significant problem, and this is something that kind of runs through what we're all saying, and I'll return to this later in the presentation too.
Yeah, as Rosie's mentioned, so aside from the legal and policy frameworks that I've discussed, there's more problems lying in enforcement and detection software and how that's being designed and deployed to identify harm. So our next question is, what are the impacts of platforms relying more heavily on automated decision making and making these decisions at scale? And if you look directly at Facebook's community standards, for example, they restrict digitally created sexual activity unless it's posted for educational, humorous, or satirical purposes. But there's difficulty for automated systems in drawing the line between what content is humorous, as Ari has discussed, or what content is educational, especially where pleasure and entertainment are part of education. There's numerous reports of users having content removed simply because it contained an explicit word, even though it was to promote an event or a conference or a resource. And to offer my own example, I recently spoke at an event for Digital Rights Watch, which was blocked by Twitter for violating their ads policy, presumably because it contained the word sex in the title, even though it was a public event and we were there to speak about issues around censorship and regulation. And then last year, I was working with Scarlet Alliance, and one of their tweets was blocked because it had the word whore in it, even though it was promoting an event called Whore Stories, which was a night of sex worker storytelling. So we know that algorithms don't adequately understand context and therefore have broad overcapture. And there's some great research by Alice Witt, who found very inconsistent moderation of women's bodies on Instagram in particular, and identified that 22% of the images removed were actually false positives. This is a campaign called Everybody Visible, which has encouraged users to upload their own images that had been taken down and provide their own kind of counter response. There's also a really insightful piece of research from the University of Sao Paulo and Stanford Law School, which found that tweets by drag queens on Twitter were rated higher for toxic speech than tweets by white nationalists. So these kinds of sentiment analysis tools that often just read explicit words as inherently toxic don't always understand this sufficiently, the ways in which language may convey different meanings, especially for different users and LGBTQ people. But then it's not just about speech. Nudity classifiers are particularly problematic in identifying body parts or skin tones. They're often based on unrepresentative training data sets. Facial recognition technology has high rates of error when purporting to recognize the age and gender of people, and has been proven to have significant racial bias. And then classifiers that attempt to recognize the gender of people's nipples is always going to fail, simply because not all nipples are gendered, or they're gendered in ways that are unintelligible to the cisnormative assumptions and configurations of machine classifiers. So I'm working on a project at the moment that's being led by Professor Kath Aubrey at Swinburne in partnership with UNESCO. And so our next step is where we'll be launching an international survey that examines how these forms of automated content moderation impact, which purport to identify and remove harm, actually impact community development work and sexual health and HIV prevention, as well as the distribution of sex ed material.
Thanks, Zahra. So in my work, I focus on content moderation, but also how we can use automation to develop tools that actually enable women to feel safe online. But first off, I wanted to talk about platforms' use of automated content moderation tools. So of course, relying on automated moderation systems risks over-capturing seemingly offensive content, as Zahra has spoken about, but it fails to recognize this more normalized abuse. And platforms operate according to a logic that emphasizes overt hate speech and diminishes this everyday normalized behavior. And this raises really crucial questions about whether the data models and logics of platforms' automated systems are driven by their conceptual understandings of safety and harm, or by what they happen to collect and what they can actually train their automated tools to do. But platforms can't build better automated tools until they really understand how their users experience harm and safety on their networks. And this is much more contextually difficult than what a classifier can actually detect. And I think we're really reaching the limits of the usefulness of this approach. Now, even if platforms could develop perfect algorithms that detect all types of abuse and understand context, as long as they're thinking about the problem in terms of content, they're not going to be able to actually prevent the things that underpin harm. Platforms say that their automated moderation tools proactively prevent harm, but we've been misled to think that content moderation is an appropriate mechanism to solve online gender-based violence and other online harms. And these messages have served to align the notion of the notion of justice for gender-based violence with the logics of platforms. So as Tarleton Gillespie says, content moderation is a really important commodity that platforms provide, but it's certainly not what we can rely on to actually foster and cultivate safe and inclusive digital environments. So when platforms focus on improving their automated tools, they lose sight of the other things that could cultivate these safe spaces. Of course, platforms cannot solve all of the conditions that enable harm, but there are certainly steps that they could take and at the bare minimum avoid reproducing structural inequality. So we should try to use automated decision-making systems to enable users to feel safe online, but we're really at this point where we're seeing some pretty bad uses of automation. So I think the next step is to actually go and have a look at what other platforms are doing, to see what they're experimenting with and try to figure out what actually and how we can actually measure their effectiveness. To create scalable automated interventions, we need answers to some really crucial questions like where might automation work and what else could we do where it won't? There are many challenges to realizing this. We need to figure out what we can actually measure about behavior and how we might collect and analyze better data to evaluate different platform interventions. And then for the things that we can't measure, we actually need to go out and talk to users. So I think that deep qualitative research is going to be really important here.
So yeah, thanks a lot. Like Rosie and Zahra have brilliantly explained the limitations of automated approaches to content moderation, most of which also apply to humorous content. So I thought that to end this, like the answers to our question, I would just show an example of satire that punches up that Facebook did not understand. And in this slide, you can see the iconic Australian children's entertainers, the Wiggles, that announced last month that they would be adding new members and characters to make their team more culturally and gender diverse. And this move was criticized by National Senator Matt Canavan, who complained that the Wiggles had become too woke. And in response, the satirical group wrote a headline on their website that said that the show had introduced a new white Wiggle to help Matt Canavan feel represented. Now, this joke is serving a socially corrective purpose by punching up. So it has a clear target, that it's Matt Canavan, that it's in a dominant position of power because he's a politician. But Facebook was not happy with the hate symbol represented by the white wiggle and took the post down as violating Facebook's hate speech policies. And this could be due both because Facebook moderators did not understand this joke as punching up, but it could also be because Facebook's algorithms recognized the hate symbol and took the post down, because as both Rosie and Zahra have explained, like automated approaches to hate speech are only good if they recognize really overt like hate content as this visual depiction of the Ku Klux Klan. And as activists have long denounced, this is another example of why automated approaches to hate speech unfortunately end up disproportionately taking down counter speech. And in this case, it's counter speech mediated through humor. So all of our examples, and as Rosie said, like maybe like content moderation is not the only approach to really minimize harm through like on social media platforms.
Okay, so after that discussion, you're probably thinking, all right, what can platforms do and regulators to actually prevent and mitigate harm? So the question is, how can platforms, stakeholders, and regulators better respond to online harm? So ultimately, platforms need to re-envision their approach to self-regulation. What we see working is when community norms respect women and other vulnerable groups. And what we see fail is when there are no rules, there are bad rules, or the rules are applied in a really tokenistic way. So in a work in progress study that I'm conducting with Professor Nick Suzor, we've been examining the challenges of combating misogyny on the platform Reddit. Now, of course, Reddit is a platform where diverse groups can build safe communities, but it also has this really long history of hosting racist, homophobic, misogynistic, and otherwise harmful subreddits. So in this study, we've drawn on archived Reddit data to investigate the misogynistic and now banned incel or involuntary celibate subreddits. And we're interrogating how incel subreddits adapted to and resisted pressure from Reddit and also other users to comply with the site-wide rules and also develop their own rules and norms. So our study suggests that punitive measures such as the threat of stricter rules and increased external moderation is insufficient to foster pro-social subreddits. And we show how stricter enforcement of the site-wide rules did not challenge or displace the underlying ideology that actually fosters harmful communities. And so we argue that Reddit must focus on improving the culture of subreddits, and that driving the real change here actually requires the committed participation of moderators who can do that really hard work of tackling the underlying ideology that brings these hateful communities together. Now, of course, Reddit operates under a different content moderation system to most dominant platforms, right? Since it relies on its community moderators to undertake the subreddit's governance. But I think there's still so much that we can learn from this and learn what works and potentially what doesn't. So the first step then is not content moderation, but I think it's about trying to instill a respect for women and other vulnerable and marginalised groups. So as I noted earlier, there are significant similarities between top-down governance systems and Western models of criminal justice. And so when we consider these similarities between these governance systems, I think that there's an opportunity to draw on theories of justice that show us how we can actually better repair harm. And one of these that could help us re-envision platform governance is called transformative justice. And this alternative version of justice is not a new concept. Rather, its principles are grounded in the experiences of people of colour, and it centres marginalised communities. So most simply, transformative justice looks towards collective community-based responses to interpersonal violence, rather than these punitive criminal forms of justice. And so transformative justice advocates say that we can't end violence, we can't use violence to end violence. And so this approach focuses on addressing the things that actually prevent violence, such as healing and accountability. And I should say that this is certainly not about excusing people for the harm that they have caused, but it recognises that we need to understand the context and the conditions that actually lead to harm. So what might this alternative version of justice look like online? Unfortunately, I don't know how platforms can address the underlying causes of misogyny, but I do really think that we need to figure out how we can change these community norms before we can think about rehabilitating those who have caused harm. And we also need to think about how to foster inclusive and respectful digital platforms. After all, feeling safe online isn't just about being free from harm. Something that I think might be a little bit clearer at the moment is how we can better centre victim survivors in platform governance approaches. So Bumble is a really interesting example of this, which you can see on the screen here. And so what it's done is it's created this triaged survivor-led trauma response care. And so it's a partnership with the survivor-led and intersectional nonprofit called Chain. And the new service enables Bumble users who have been sexually assaulted access to this remote trauma counselling with the help of automation. So initiatives like Bumble's are really trying to help women, but the next step then is to actually evaluate these initiatives. Over the next couple of years, I'm going to really interrogate platforms' automated tools to really think about what data they need to develop and deploy even more effective interventions. And I really want to think about how we can draw on transformative justice to realise this.
Thanks, Rosie. Similar to that, I agree that the response needs to be grounded in broader social and cultural change in addition to legal and technological solutions. And a lot of the resources that are currently spent on screening, detection or carceral approaches could be redirected, redistributed, reinvested into community responses and initiatives, especially around prevention and support efforts, and including comprehensive and culturally relevant and tailored sex education and consent education. I want to talk briefly about a RightsCon session that we held in June. RightsCon is a global summit on human rights in the digital age. And our session was called Alternative Frameworks for Sexual Content Moderation. And I facilitated a discussion there with a range of other sex workers and sexuality scholars, including Gisley, Emily Coombs, Emily van den Ekel, Katrine Tiedenberg, and Mireille Miller-Young. And as a result of that workshop that we held, we're now currently drafting a manifesto for sex-positive social media, and we're hoping that individuals and collectives and organisations will want to sign on and contribute. So this is a plug to say, please get in touch if you'd like to be involved. But the manifesto, it takes a holistic approach to spelling out some of the basics. The regulation of sex is political, platform regulation shapes our erotic imagination and our sexual possibilities. Sex is social and cultural, it can be integrated into media. But it also sets out how sex-positive social media requires shifts in the structures and the businesses and the revenue models of platforms who need to start valuing content creators in a material way rather than just exploiting them or treating them as disposable. It's a kind of restructuring that means that social media platforms can't just rely on consultation or tokenism or market research among sexually marginalized communities. They need to actually prioritize those communities as stakeholders and decision makers and leaders in their governance models. Creating sex-positive social media is also about platforms being transparent about the values that guide their design and decision-making rather than just pretending that they're neutral. And instead of targeting sex, they could be aiming to prevent and address sexism, racism, transphobia, whorephobia, ableism, and other manifestations of structural oppression on their platforms. I think what's really important is that platforms need to remember that legality and illegality are not determinative of whether content is consensual or ethical. There's many forms of sexual activity that are unlawful in various parts of the world, and social media companies don't need to simply use restrictive or repressive regulatory regimes as their baseline standard for governing sexual content. They actually have a really exciting opportunity here to improve on the poor sexual ethics of governments. It's also, like I mentioned before, about transparent decision-making, not only accessible appeals, individualized reasons, independent dispute resolution processes, but also avenues for users to understand and evaluate the recommender systems, how the sexual content is being ranked or organized or sorted. And finally, I think it involves an enabling legal environment, because addressing harm isn't simply about swift takedowns or quantitative measures or increased surveillance or more new automated tools. We need governments to decriminalize consensual sexual activity, repeal laws that hinder access to sex education and safety information, and then regulate to prevent the formation of media monopolies and materially support the proliferation of independent media, platform cooperatives, and alternative economies.
Great. So I echo everything that Zahra and Rosie have said into like how platforms, stakeholders, and regulators could better respond to online harm. And in relation to humor, that I think that they could better respond to harmful humor by paying attention to power. Because given the challenges that are involved in drawing causal links between online content and specific harms, it is very important to conceptualizing and assessing harms in light of society's broader structural conditions. So humor that punches down on historically marginalized groups is an example of an objective harm rather than a subjective offense, whose nature is only truly understood once broader systems of structural oppression are factored in. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm using standpoint theory to theorize and assess harmful humor online. And particularly, I use one of standpoint theory's main concepts, that it's positionality, and positionality invites reflection on how our multiple social positions influence and impact our everyday interactions. So to finish this presentation, I like to operationalize positionality as kind of an alternative framework for differentiating between humor that punches up as socially beneficial and humor that punches down as socially harmful. So in this slide, I have added two examples of parody, which parody is a specific type of humor that it's forced to reference that which it mocks. And these two parodies that I'm showing here were treated by platforms in a way that negatively affected racial minorities in the US. So on the left side, you can see a screenshot from a news article about a video that went viral on Twitter after Trump's victory in 2016. And the video features a Black teenager performing a white face makeup tutorial. And her account was suspended by Twitter after users flagged it for being racist. And then on the right, we have another screenshot of a news article about YouTube star Shane Dawson when he publicly apologized for having engaged in blackface and other racist jokes during at the beginning of his career without YouTube ever intervening on this content. So Dawson apologized in a moment of collective reckoning in the US on race and racism following the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests in the aftermath of the police killing of George Floyd. And in the midst of this kind of cultural audit, if you will, these racist parodies were considered by some, like Dawson himself, to be more socially unacceptable now than they were in the past. While for racial minorities, blackface has always been deemed harmful. So following Linda Alcoff's call to consider positionality for evaluating the meaning of interactions, the details of who is parodying whom become key to objectively determining the harms derived from humor. So in this case, while Dawson was engaging in blackface from a position of race privilege, and while blackface is linked to a history of violence, the Black teenager was engaging in whiteface from a position of racial disadvantage, and whiteface is not linked to a history of violence. Accordingly, only Dawson's parody could be considered harmful humor, because the whiteface parody might have been offensive for some white audiences, but it's definitely not harmful based on the definition that I provided earlier. So to wrap up, I hope that you have enjoyed this panel, and we are looking forward to have a discussion. We are happy with comments and questions.
Thank you so much, Rosie, Zahra, and Ari. So we are now moving into the Q&A part of the seminar today. And those of you who are online, you will have noticed that the chat function is disabled, and your questions, and you can submit your questions in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens. Those of you who are online, you have a champion in the room, Aaron. You won't see him, but you will hear him, who will relay your questions to the panel. And I think that's all we need to know. So thank you once again, Rosie, Zahra, and Ari. That was really interesting to hear about your research and your findings. So I'll look out at the good people in the room. Do we have any immediate questions from the room?
Or comments?
Yeah, comments are welcome too.
Or comments? Yes.
Hello. I guess one thing I'm interested in is particularly around the transformative justice approaches, Rosie. Where do you think the balance lies between putting the responsibility? I guess my concern, and it's something that I come up against a lot, is I don't want to put responsibility on victim survivors to, deal with their trauma. Like, why does it fall onto them? And I think that's something that's a bit challenging with transformative justice sort of approaches. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts. I feel very awkward speaking to a microphone.
Thank you, Lucinda. Yeah, look, you make a really good point. But I mean, in my presentation, I focused on what Chain was doing with Bumble, that approach. And I spoke about that because that was a clear example of something that platforms are doing that's kind of moving in that direction. And I think a huge part of the problem is going to be, how do we actually hold the people who cause harm to account? And to be honest, I really don't know how we answer that. Yeah, like I would like to spend the next couple of years thinking really deeply about that, because I think that is so important. And you're right, we shouldn't be making victim survivors do everything here. And the platforms need to play a really big role in this process. But I think that it is really important to give the victim survivors agency, and so that they can use like Bumble's remote trauma counselling so that they can go and get that support if they want it, or they don't have to, or they can use select bits of it. So I think it's good to be able to still give them that option, because we know that, as you would be aware, most content moderation systems, if somebody reports something that's happened, content or behaviour, they often don't receive a reply, which is what I found in my research. Or they get a response, but it's not very meaningful. So yeah, look, yes, I completely understand where you're coming from, and I really want to do that really important work. Yeah.
And I can just add something too about transformative justice approaches from a kind of offline context. Often, you know, we speak about transformative justice now because it's not simply about restorative justice and restoring the existing relationships, but actually something systemic needs to change. So we need to think about transforming the systems. And so often that's come because people have traditionally such poor experiences in the criminal legal system, as opposed to the criminal justice system, because it doesn't really deliver justice. And like Rosie has said, like a lot of the initiatives of many of these platforms are trying to simply mirror the processes of traditional criminal legal systems. Like in this new research that we're doing, looking at automated tools and interventions, platforms that have created strike policies like 3 strike warnings and then you're banned. Like it, you know, that comes directly from different mandatory sentencing approaches that we know don't work in an offline context. Recently, we just published an article on why sex workers don't contact the police. It's in a QUT journal of International Journal of Crime, Justice and Social Democracy. And, you know, it goes through all of these reasons why people wouldn't want to use, report to authorities because of their experiences of entrapment and bribery and arrest and identification. And so, and much of this work also comes, well, it really comes from Indigenous communities, Black and Indigenous and people of colour who can't call the police, who can't report because you know, then their data may be used to develop other predictive policing tools or be misused for the purposes of kind of poorly informed reasonable suspicion. Or and there's a great book called The Revolution Starts at Home on confronting intimate violence in activist communities. And there's great resources that I think we can learn from offline in terms of like what works and what doesn't work in an online context. For people who have had to develop that in a more informal way. I think we can still learn from circle sentencing and things that happen also within, like affiliated within the criminal legal system process. But I think we need to be putting more resources into learning what people are doing in more of those informal and community environments, particularly because to take the example of sexual violence, we know that imprisoning somebody is not going to teach them to become a better sexual citizen. They're not going to learn consent education in prison. Like we know that prisons are criminogenic, that they don't necessarily lead to rehabilitation, that there's a whole lot of problems with people reintegrating into communities and not having adequate housing and support, etc. So why would we just apply the same approach to an online context? And there's a really great book on this called The Feminist and the Sex Offender, and it's by Judith Levine and Erica Miners, and they basically talk all about the problems with the sex offender registry in the US. But it's a rethink about this kind of carceral politics behind the way that dating apps in particular have turned to increase surveillance and relationships and partnerships with police as their solution to harm.
Thank you. I think we have some questions online. So if we take one of those before we go back to a question from the room. Aaron?
Thanks, Patrick. Thank you, panelists. I have a question here from Jean Burgess for all the panelists. The focus on harm and how to prevent or minimize it is highly relevant, and there's a promising need for it. In a feminist or queer studies framework, though, we might want to think a little outside of the protective, carceral, and punitive logics that can result from a harm-based framework. Could each of you try and articulate what forms of agency or positive or pleasurable experiences we would be able to foster if we could prevent these harms?
Who want to go first on that one?
It's hard not having a question in front of us. can you say that last bit again?
Yes.
Can each of you try and articulate what forms of agency or positive or pleasurable experiences we might be able to foster if we could prevent these harms? So,
I can go first, but it's a quick answer, Jean. No, I think that the kind of pleasures and joy that could derive from preventing harms is when we really understand humor that punches up as socially beneficial from punching up as socially harmful. Then you really allow like marginalized communities, queer folks, feminists to really be able to express online through humor, through satire, through parody, without being banned or flagged or wrongly flagged again by algorithms. So in this sense, if we know that the current mechanisms do not work, and normally what we get is disproportionately like kind of policing of counter speech, by understanding power, by understanding how like a background of structural inequality is really impacting the way that we identify what counts as harmful, then we could allow these forms of like humor to flourish, like the ones that punch up in a way that are not constantly policed.
Thank you for the curly question, Jean. This is actually quite difficult for me to answer because, like, I mean, it makes me think about the work that I've been doing with Professor Kath Albury and Zahra. We've been doing it. Zahra's leading a study on dating apps, and in this, you know, we've been thinking about how it's not like there's only harm online. Obviously, what we've been saying, this reflects society's broader attitudes. And so it's difficult because it's not like I'm thinking, it's hard for me to compare it to something, I guess. But I mean, I'm thinking about my dating apps research, and how amazing would it be if women could go on Tinder or other dating apps, any platform, and not have to consider their safety at every step of the dating process, for instance. So I recently published an article in Feminist Media Studies where I'm talking about how the women who I interviewed drew upon a range of safety work strategies and to protect themselves. And this started on the platform, but also when they met up with men offline. And because of that, you know, throughout the whole dating process, they were thinking about their safety every step of the way. And they knew they couldn't rely on Tinder, as I mentioned in the presentation. So this drained them of so much energy. This is, you know, what they were thinking about all the time. And even in the interviews, when I said to them, like, what is it that you do to keep yourself safe on Tinder? They actually didn't know how to answer that question. But then throughout the interviews, they actually impact all of these things that they were doing, but it was just so ingrained in them. So, I mean, it would be pretty nice to not have to do that, but I don't know what that looks like. Yeah, it's hard for me to imagine that future.
Well, I think that's a really important point, that the existing platforms, policies, and discussions foreclose our imagination. And we spend and invest so much time and energy and resources in this reactive space. Facebook has done something terrible. We need to tell them how to improve. And we get wrapped up in basically wasting all of our energy that we could be spending nurturing our communities and coming up with alternatives. And I feel like that is the real devastating consequence of all of this. But I did want to point to some sites that are doing really exciting things. There's a new website now called Lips Social, which is positioning itself as an alternative to Facebook and Instagram. And it's a kind of queer, sex positive social media platform. And they're taking a really different approach to how they think about moderation. And I mean, to take, for example, the dick pic, it's not the fact that there is nudity that makes it a problem, but it is perhaps the behavior and the ways in which it may be used to harass or intimidate someone, or it's the unsolicited nature of it that makes it problematic rather than the nudity itself. So I'm just undoing some of those ways in which we kind of assume this equals harm, because whatever. And there's also a really great a group called TogetherNet, which are rethinking what consent looks like on platforms, and they're taking this whole consent process to like whether your material is archived or whether it is private and it disappears. And they're doing a really great presentation next week with the sex worker group in New York called Decoding Stigma, where they're talking about some of their work. There's a new there's a lot more platform cooperatives coming up now. Peep Me is one, and also Assembly 4, who is the Australian sex worker technology group who created their own version of Twitter, which they called Switter, which is a sex worker friendly Twitter. So things are happening, people are doing really fun stuff. But I also wanted to say that, like, taking a queer perspective, like, I think queer politics and pleasures are often about transgression, and particularly in my research when I was looking at the ways in which people were resisting classification categories and the assumption that kink was, you know, equated to violence. There was a real pleasure in transgressing the law and transgressing those norms. And the ways that many platforms make sense of not just not sexual material, but body fluids in particular. There's a great table by a porn performer, Sophie Ladder. It's on Twitter. She's mapped out all of these different like webcamming sites and other sites, and that she's mapped specifically the kinds of activities they allow and don't allow. And a lot of them really conflate like body fluids with other harmful activities like assault or bestiality and other things. But the thing, like, so from a queer perspective, thinking about polymorphous pleasures and the pleasures of lactation or erotic vomiting or menstruation or water sports, things that are basically banned from view and become sanitized. I wrote an article that was called Safe for Work, because basically the kinds of content that producers I spoke to were making were safe for work, because they're like, we can't do any of these, so we'll just do a really hetero vanilla scene and then we'll post that, and then we won't even bother filming this stuff because we're not going to be able to sell it or host it anywhere. And so it has a real chilling effect on the kinds of creative agency that individuals have.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Let's take a question from the room. Louisa.
Thank you. So my question is a bit broad, and I don't expect an answer to it, but more maybe there's like a bit you'd want to say about it. And it links a little bit to what Zahra just ended with, actually. With a lot of these issues, it seems to me that one of the problems is, if you're talking about a platform like Facebook, which is dealing with a huge, a really diverse population with very different norms, and that is not to say we should not have, so what I'm trying to say is there's a difference between having these sort of smaller sites with shared norms, where you can have transgressive acts, for instance, which would be understood within that context as safe and empowering, and say Twitter or Facebook. And so my question is, and given that there are problems with the model of a platform like Facebook or Twitter that itself can be harmful, is like, how do you think about these questions of harm and safety in the context of the platform structure, the audience it has, the reach it has, and because it seems like even with things like age verification, and there's this challenge of how do you create like sort of audiences that are okay for this content. And yeah, I'm just wondering, and I know it's broad and I know there isn't enough, but maybe through your work, what have you done to account for these things, or how do you think about
that? Yes, let me speak to that. I wanted to say first, I think your question is partly about, like, is there global community standards, and I feel like the problem scale, and is the problem greed that companies want to have such massive platforms that can't possibly resonate with every different local or cultural community. And I know there were some people at the Beckman Klein Center who did a whole paper about the problem with scale, and perhaps that's where things are going wrong with that kind of very capitalist and white colonial approach to just like, we can have this one model and it's going to be universally relevant to everybody. But also to think back to like Ari's work and perhaps the issue, instead of governments like looking towards the most repressive framework and being like, oh, we want our website to be available in that country, so therefore we'll just take that as our baseline standard. Perhaps they should be listening more to marginalised communities to inform how they're thinking about the problems to begin with and how they're thinking about power. I think some of these issues can be addressed partly through user controls, and like I know Lips Social, for example, when you go on their website, you can tick, yes, I want to see these kinds of things. No, I don't want to see these kinds of things. But there is still a politics associated with that. Like if you look at Instagram's new sensitivity filter, like where they say automatically, like we're going to automatically flag all of these things as sensitive, and then you can opt out of it. So there are still decisions being made on that level about what kind of content is borderline or what kind of content is sensitive.
Yeah, and not only like user controlled, I think that there's also like the willing, these are global platforms and there's so much room to improve, as you've said, like with like really departing from the experiences of those that are experiencing harm. So that would like, you can transform this knowledge into like better policies, but also in the way that we inform users in like the blogs that you are doing your research, or if you are, I don't know, with the strikes. So just giving more information in a way that like users can understand why power is important. And I don't think it's that far-fetched to imagine like platforms like bringing like structural inequality into the picture and just trying to like acknowledge it, like the example of the racial stereotypes, the harmful stereotypes that Facebook recently included in the policy. So this is a first step, and obviously it happened in the US because you have organizations like Color of Change doing a lot of advocacy, lobbying work to these platforms for them to really acknowledge why blackface is problematic. That's why now we have it in the policies, because it has links with histories of violence. So with like the Jews will rule the world. This is another of the racial stereotypes that has been included. And with informal conversations with Facebook, they at least publicly acknowledge like, yeah, if we want to say like be adding things into this list, we have to, in Australia, we have to talk with like Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and see like the common stereotypes that they are subjected to. So I think that there's still like, yes, there's a problem of scale, that it's really difficult to then like consider all the context that are, but it's so limited, their approach, that really they can't do. And the last thing I would say that just came to my mind now, sometimes it's as easy when COVID, with you, Luisa, we were looking at this, right? At the beginning of your PhD, that you wanted to look at COVID and misinformation and even linking it to humor. They did a massive effort to really inform users. Okay, this is just go and providing information to links with, okay, what's happening with vaccination, what's happening with COVID. And at that time, like attacks towards people of Asian descent were happening. There was no initiative from any of the platforms to recognize that racism was happening. And it would have been so easy to just say it. And again, like just directing users to the policies. And it's just a political choice that they decided not to do and not to engage with. It's not because it's really difficult to implement. This was a global crisis where globally in a lot of Western countries, these attacks were taking place, but they decided to not take action. So these kind of things, I feel that probably we would agree that could easily be improved.
I probably don't have too much to add to that, because I think you've covered covered the issues really well. But I mean, like, so what you were saying, these platforms were built and they didn't have these problems in mind. And like Zahra mentioned, the real problem here is capitalism. So platforms are greedy. And also with Ari talking about different community-based approaches, I think that that is really important. But I'm also really mindful of these tokenistic, just add diversity and stir approaches, which we know are not meaningful and they don't actually work. And I mean, it gets me thinking about various social media platforms like Twitter's Trust and Safety Council. We don't actually really know what's going on there. They've supposedly partnered with a range of community organizations from around the globe. And it looks really good on paper, but we don't actually know what's going on behind the scenes. So that does concern me a little bit. But I can't remember what else I was going to say there. I think you guys have covered that well. Thank you.
Is trust and safety just a new form of PR?
Well, yeah. I think
Okay,
so.
great. We have some questions from the Zoom audience. So over to you, Aaron.
Thank you. We have another one here from Sean Hasselback. Sean asks, in your views, what are the arguments around deplatforming either individuals or whole groups, for example, removal of a subreddit, to prevent the spread and presence of harmful views? As an example, after Trump was banned from Twitter, there was a 73% drop in election misinformation.
I think the research on deplatforming is quite varied at the moment. I mean, I've read a couple of studies about this recently, and it's unclear to the extent to which it kind of just moves the problem somewhere else. And I mean, for the work that I was talking about earlier that I'm doing with Professor Nick Suzor, we've been looking at how after the incel subreddits were banned and what happened. And we can see that most of the users actually did, it looks like they left Reddit after it was deplatformed. We know there are other forums on the internet where incels are now housed. And, you know, I mean, I don't know how effective that response was. And like I said, I mean, content moderation is a band-aid solution, but it may be the case that it stops people from stumbling across this type of rhetoric when they're just searching on Reddit. I still think that it's not really getting to the root cause of the problem, which I think is what we really need to be focusing on heavily. But do either of you have anything to say about deplatforming?
I suppose I've spoken today mostly about deplatforming in terms of the kind of negative impact of deplatforming on people who probably shouldn't have been deplatformed. But yeah, I think it's a good question thinking about the Trump decision and the oversight board and the comments there around the need to have more transparent policies and stick to your kind of terms of service in terms of your account suspensions and deletions and the periods that they apply for, and make sure that all is really available to users. I guess my other thoughts are also, because we've been talking a little bit about transformative justice and the problems with prisons, what are the impacts of excising community members or excising anyone as opposed to taking a more educative response, or where are the points, or how do we build in points before that stage, or which involve a bit more of an educative response or some kind of accountability or redress, or something that will lead to a little bit more like long-term change rather than just excising parts of the population.
Yeah, just to finish quickly. But I think that sometimes deplatforming does not work with people that are oblivious to the harm that they are causing. So it can cause a reactive like answer because you don't know that you were causing harm. So again, it's just like similar to what you both were saying, that sometimes we need like better information, but with the more overt and cases, deplatforming, yeah, if you are being harassed, maybe it works. So yeah.
I think we have more questions than we have time to get to, but let's you pick one, Aaron, from the list.
Oh, pressure's on. I'm gonna.
We've also got our email addresses up there, so we're really happy to just keep chatting to people afterwards by email too.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just going to go chronologically. A question from Nick Dowse. Nick asks, there's some moves afoot in the US and the EU to break up Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, Messenger, etc. To what extent do you think regulatory interventions like this might help or hinder efforts to reduce online harms on these platforms?
I will just say one thing in relation to that, and that is there's a really amazing scholar and software engineer that I met through the Berkman Klein Center. His name is Zahra Stardust, and he has written a whole essay about how and why to break up Facebook. And I'm pretty sure he did an event there at the Berkman Klein Center about it. And he goes through like 5 different practical steps of how to break up Facebook. So I will refer to him on that topic as someone who has thought, he used to be a Facebook employee. So he has a real granular, like detailed understanding of like how that might work in practice and what some of the benefits might be. So yes, I'll defer to him. His name's Zahra Stardust.
I mean, I'm not an expert, but I would say that like companies like Facebook amassing like this amount of power having in all these services, this is no good. So anything that could, and obviously then whatever they decide is what happens, and this can increase like and amplify harm. So, but yeah, I'm not really an expert.
But it is about breaking up monopolies, I think. And if you look at like what happened with the News Media Bargaining Code, and it's not just about protecting dominant news platforms, it's about how do we have a more diverse and equitable social media space where there is a proliferation of lots of local groups who are able to do their own things and create their own community standards and work locally with their communities.
Yeah.
That will be our last question. So thank you so much, Rosie, Zahra, Ari. That was really interesting. Thank you everyone on Zoom for your questions. Thank you everyone in the room for coming here and for your questions. And apologies for the good people who have asked questions that we don't really have time to address now, but you have Ari's and Rosie's and Zahra's email addresses there. So do get in touch and continue the conversation after we finish today. So with that, we're closing the event today, and happy Friday, everyone, and enjoy the weekend. And I'll see you at the next DMRC event.